A single folded letter lay across the long oak table in the receiving hall, its edges curling from the damp that had crept into every corner of the empty house. Elira stood frozen near the cold hearth, one hand resting on the sudden frightening swell beneath her gown. The man who had promised to share this roof with her was already 3 hours gone, his horse tracks already filling with rain. 3 winters of broken floorboards and a title with no money behind it followed that single morning. When the Duke finally returned home expecting to find a wife worn thin by grief, he found something else entirely, a woman who had built a fortress out of nothing, and a household that no longer waited for him to lead it. He would have to earn his place inside walls he once walked away from. If a story about quiet strength and second chances is the kind of thing you come here for, take a moment now and tap the like button. It helps this channel keep finding stories like Elira and Edmund for you. And there is much more of their story still to come. The letter smelled faintly of cedar oil and nothing else, which Elira thought was almost worse than if it had smelled of guilt. She picked it up between 2 fingers, feeling the rough grain of cheap paper bought in haste from a coaching inn. She did not cry. The tears sat trapped somewhere behind her ribs, held down by a rising sour pressure that felt closer to anger than sorrow. Edmund had written 4 sentences. Duty, the crown, a war gathering on the eastern border, a promise to return once the continent settled itself. He had not mentioned the child growing inside her. He had not mentioned that the coal store held barely enough fuel to last until the first frost of November. She set the letter down on the table. The wood beneath it was ancient oak, scarred from generations of feasts long since forgotten, and now it held nothing but a guttering tallow candle and 4 sentences written in haste. Elira pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was fine wool, a gift from an aunt who had never understood that the wealth of the Castellane line was tied up entirely in stubborn clay soil and crumbling stonework. The shawl did nothing against the cold seeping out of the walls. "Your Grace," a dry voice said from the archway. Holt, the estate steward, stood there clutching a leather-bound ledger the way a soldier might clutch a shield. He was made of sharp angles and graying hair, and the cuffs of his coat had begun to fray at the edges. "He rode out before dawn," Holt said. Elira heard her own voice come out strange in the cavernous room, flat and hollow. "I am aware, Your Grace," he said. "I heard the horses leave." Holt did not offer comfort. He offered the ledger instead, stepping forward across the uneven flagstones. "The baker in the village has stopped extending credit," he said. "The roof above the servants' quarters is sagging badly, and the cook says she will leave unless she is paid the wages owed to her from the old Duke time." Elira looked at the old man. She was 19 years old. She had been a bride for 4 months. She was meant to be learning how to arrange flowers and host quiet afternoon teas, not managing a bankrupt and rotting house while her husband played at soldiering to escape his own failures. Her stomach turned over, a wave of sickness hitting her hard and metallic, the taste of thin porridge rising in her throat. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles paled. She breathed through her nose, filling her lungs with the smell of dust and wet stone and the rushes rotting on the floor. "Let the cook go," Elira said. The words tasted like ash, but they came out steady. Holt blinked. "Your Grace, who will prepare the meals?" he asked. "She serves us boiled gristle and steals the good wine. I have seen her do it with my own eyes." Elira pushed herself away from the table. The sudden movement made the room tilt sharply, but she forced her spine straight. "Promote the youngest girl from the scullery," she said. "Pay the cook whatever coin remains in the strong box in the drawing room, and tell her to walk out the gate. If she refuses, tell her the magistrate will be very interested in the missing bottles of Bordeaux." She reached out and took the ledger from his hands. It was heavy, smelling of old leather and dried ink. "Show me everything," she said. "Not only the debts you think a delicate young bride can stomach." Holt hesitated, then opened the book. The pages were a mess of red ink, debts owed to the blacksmith, the miller, the tailor in the capital, the apothecary. Edmund had inherited a hollow shell of a dukedom, had married Elira for her dowry, and when that dowry had vanished into the mouths of his creditors, he had fled rather than face what remained. Elira ran a finger down the red lines until the rough paper caught at her skin. She looked up at the heavy tapestries hanging along the far wall, depicting hounds tearing at the throat of a stag, thick with dust and sagging beneath their own weight. "Take those down," she murmured. "They have hung there long enough, and they are heavy wool. Holt, take them down. We will cut them into strips and use them to seal the drafts in the rooms we still use. Then send word to the timber merchant. We are selling the mahogany dining chairs as well." It was not a sudden, heroic transformation. It was the desperate, ugly pragmatism of a cornered animal fighting for the only ground left to it. Over the following months, Elira stripped the house of every pretense it had ever held. The grand rooms were sealed shut. The silver centerpieces were sent away and melted down for coin. The cold never relented. Winter settled over the valley, like a closed fist, frost crusting the inside of every window pane. Elira gave up her corsets entirely, trading silk gowns for heavy riding trousers, and thick sweaters she knitted herself by the fire. Her nails, once smoothed with rose oil, chipped and filled with the soot that lived permanently in the hearths now. The child grew heavy inside her, an anchor tying her to these crumbling stones, whether she wanted it or not. She hated Edmund. It was not a hot, burning hatred, it was cold, the temperature of the draught sneaking beneath the door. She hated him every time she stepped over a rat trap in the kitchen. She hated him when the wind screamed down the chimney like a dying animal. But beneath that hatred, something stranger took root. A fierce and possessive feeling that had nothing to do with him at all. Edmund had walked away from this house. That meant it belonged to her now. Every leak she patched, every debt she cleared by selling another piece of his family pride, made these stones hers in a way no marriage contract ever could. There were nights that winter when the cold became something closer to an enemy soldier than weather pressing against the windows, testing the seams of the house for weakness. Elira learned to read the wind, the way Holt read his columns of figures, learned which direction carried snow and which direction simply carried misery. She learned how much oat flour could be stretched across a week if the bread was baked thin and dense instead of light. She learned that pride did not keep anyone warm, and so she set hers aside along with her silk, folding it into the same trunk and locking it shut. The merchants in the village had taken her measure quickly that first season, sizing up the pregnant girl with the cold grey eyes and deciding almost universally that she would fold within a month. She did not fold. She simply learned faster than they expected, learned which questions exposed a lie in a delivery weight, learned to walk into a negotiation already certain of the answer, so that nothing a stranger said could shake her. By the second month, even the most stubborn of them had stopped trying to charge her double for rough cloth, because the cost of being caught at it in front of the whole market square was higher than the profit was worth. The first contraction found her standing ankle-deep in mud. It was late in February, a false spring having turned the courtyard into a swamp of cold brown muck. Elira stood there in an oiled canvas cloak thrown over her enormous belly, one mud-streaked finger pointed at a wagon loaded with slate. "I asked for 50 square feet," she said to the stone merchant, her breath plumbing white in the freezing air. "This is barely 40, and the tiles are cracked besides." The merchant shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking between her fierce stare and the ruined boots she wore. "The roads were bad, Your Grace," he said. "The frost heaves broke the carts apart. I cannot help the weather. I am not paying full price for half a load of rubble." She snapped back. The pain started low in her back, a dull ache that suddenly sharpened into a band of iron tightening around her spine. She stopped speaking mid-sentence, her breath catching, the smell of wet earth and draft horses and damp wool sharpening into something close to terror. She did not gasp. She clamped her jaw shut and let the contraction peak and slowly release. "Unload what is whole," she managed to say, her voice tight. Holt will pay you for 30 feet. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, every step a careful calculation. By the time she reached the great hall, a second contraction hit, and she grabbed the edge of a heavy iron candlestand, leaning her full weight onto it as her knuckles turned white. There was no soft bedding waiting for her, no warm room filled with women ready to help. Holt found her leaning against the wall, pale and sweating despite the cold, and ran for the village midwife. The labor lasted 14 hours. Elira lay on a narrow bed in the steward quarters, the warmest room in the house simply because it sat closest to the kitchen fires. The air smelled of copper and sweat and the sharp burn of the harsh soap the midwife had scrubbed her hands with. "Push, Your Grace, push through it," the midwife grunted, a broad-shouldered woman who smelled of onions and old pipe smoke. Elira screamed, and it was not a delicate sound. It was something torn loose from the very bottom of her throat. She bit down on a rolled strip of linen until she tasted her own blood. Her body felt as though it were being split in two. There was no romance in any of it, only pain and sweat stinging her eyes, and a pressure so total it blotted out everything else. She pushed until black spots swam in her vision, until the roaring in her own ears drowned out the wind howling outside. And then suddenly, a wet rush of relief. A sharp, furious cry split the heavy air of the room. Elira fell back against the sweat-soaked pillows, her chest heaving. The midwife wiped the baby down with a rough cloth. "A girl, Your Grace, strong lungs on this one," she said, and placed the small bundle on her chest. The baby was red and wrinkled, covered in a milky film, smelling warm and faintly metallic. Elira touched the tiny flailing fist with one soot-stained finger. "Wren," she whispered, her throat raw. She looked down at the child and felt the weight she had been carrying for the house multiply 1,000 times over. She was not simply patching a roof anymore. She was building a fortress for this small, fragile creature who had not asked to be born into any of it. By the time Wren was walking, the house had become unrecognizable. Elira had leased the eastern grazing fields to a sheep farmer from the village, demanding payment in both coin and raw wool. Spinning wheels clattered constantly in the great hall now, which smelled of lanolin and hot wax and roasting root vegetables instead of dust and decay. The floors had been scrubbed and patched with raw pine planks. It clashed badly with the old stonework, but it held. Elira herself had hardened along with the house. The frightened bride was gone entirely. In her place stood a woman with permanent ink stains on her fingers from managing the ledgers, a sharp tongue that frightened the local merchants, and a deep, abiding pragmatism that left no room for sentiment. She carried Wren on her hip while negotiating grain prices. She bounced the toddler while pointing out rotten floor beams to the carpenters. The house no longer hummed with idle leisure. It buzzed with the kind of frantic, necessary work that kept a family alive. She had also become someone the tenants trusted in a way they had never trusted the old Duke or his father before him. When a thatcher fell from a ladder and broke his wrist, it was Elira who arranged for his family to receive grain through the worst of his recovery, deducted quietly from the estate accounts under a line she labeled simply as repairs. When a widow in the village could not pay her rent through a hard month, Elira extended it without comment, because she remembered too well what it felt like to stand at the edge of ruin with a child depending on her. The house ran on sweat and arithmetic, but somewhere beneath the arithmetic, it had also begun to run on a kind of loyalty that no amount of inherited title could have purchased. When a letter occasionally arrived bearing the seal of the Duke, Elira did not open it. She tossed it directly onto the kitchen fire, watching the wax bubble and the parchment blacken and curl into ash. "You should read those," Holt murmured one evening, watching a letter burn down to nothing. The old steward had developed a deep, grudging respect for her over the years, though he still clung to some ghost of his old loyalty to his master. "Will the words inside fix the water pump in the courtyard?" Elira asked, rocking a half-asleep Wren in her lap. "Will they pay for her winter boots?" "He is still your husband," Holt said quietly. "No, Holt," Elira said, looking into the fire. He is a legal arrangement on a piece of paper. This house runs on sweat now, not on titles. Edmund expected to find ruins. As he rode his exhausted horse up the winding, muddy road toward home, rain soaking through his heavy cavalry coat, he braced himself for the guilt waiting on the other side. He had been gone 3 years, 3 years of blood and illness, and the constant roar of artillery. He came back with a noticeable limp, 2 missing fingers on his left hand lost to a blast of grape shot, and a soul scraped almost hollow by everything he had seen. He expected the gates to be rusted shut. He expected the roof to have caved in long ago. He expected Elira, if she had not already fled back to her own family, to be a weeping, half-starved figure ready to throw 3 years of misery at his feet the moment he walked through the door. He rode into the courtyard and stopped. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat as he blinked. The courtyard was paved now, fresh gravel crunching beneath the hooves of his horse. The stables, which had been leaning dangerously when he left, stood braced with heavy fresh timber and newly thatched. A stable boy of perhaps 14, dressed in clean mended wool, ran out to take the reins without hesitation. Edmund dismounted, a jolt of pain shooting up his ruined leg. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse and cold. "Tam, sir," the boy answered, taking the horse without a second glance at the mud-caked, scarred stranger standing before him. "Stable hand, are you here to sell grain? You will need to go round to the kitchen door at the back." Edmund stared at the boy, a deep and total sense of alienation washing over him. He was a stranger standing in his own courtyard. He did not correct the boy. He turned and walked toward the main doors instead. The heavy iron hinges did not scream the way they once had. They glided smoothly, smelling faintly of fresh grease. He stepped into the great hall, and the air hit him first, warm, deeply and thoroughly warm. The 2 great fireplaces, which used to smoke terribly and freeze the room despite their size, now drew perfectly, filled with roaring logs. The air smelled of roasting meat and dried herbs and beeswax. The old tapestries were gone. The stone walls had been scrubbed clean in their place. The delicate, rotting chairs had been replaced with heavy, practical oak benches, and at the center table, surrounded by ledgers, sat his wife. Edmund stopped in the shadow of the doorway. He barely recognized her. Elira was not wearing silk. She wore a plain grey wool dress, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hair, once curled carefully each morning, was braided back tightly against her skull. She looked older, sharper, with a smudge of black ink across one cheek. As he watched, a small child ran across the floorboards, dark curling hair tangled, clutching a wooden toy horse. She crashed into Elira's knees. Elira did not scold her. She scooped the girl up with one arm, balancing her on a hip, while continuing to read the page in front of her without losing her place. Edmund breath. Caught, a daughter. His daughter, a dull ache bloomed somewhere deep in his chest. He felt filthy standing there, smelling of wet horse and old blood and stale sweat. He belonged to the mud of distant battlefields, not to this clean, busy, functioning room. He took a step forward, his boot heel striking the floorboards loudly. Elira looked up. There was no gasp, no dropped ledger. She simply stared at him, her eyes clear and cold as winter water, taking in his ruined coat, his unshaven face, the missing fingers resting on the hilt of his sword. The silence stretched thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft babble of the child on her hip. Edmund opened his mouth. He had rehearsed a dozen speeches on the long ride home, apologies and explanations of duty and pleas for forgiveness. But looking at her now, at the calluses on her hands and the complete absence of need in the way she held herself, every single word he had prepared simply evaporated. "You are alive," she said. It was not a question, and it was not an exclamation of joy. It was a plain statement of fact. "I am," Edmund answered, his voice sounding pitifully small inside the vast hall. He swallowed hard. "Elira, She cut him off without raising her voice, though the steel inside it filled the room completely. "Take your muddy boots off that rug," she said, pointing a pen at his feet. "I traded 3 tons of winter wheat to the weavers for that rug, and I will not have you ruin it in your first 5 minutes home." Edmund looked down at the thick wool rug beneath his dripping boots, then back up at his wife. The sheer absurd domesticity of the demand stripped away whatever noble, tragic homecoming he had imagined on the ride in. Slowly, awkwardly, his face burning with shame and a strange, unexpected relief, the Duke of Hallamere bent down, struggling against his stiff leg, and pulled the boots from his feet. He stood there in damp socks, holding the muddy leather, looking at his wife. She had already returned to her ledger, though he caught a tight muscle jumping along her jaw. "Welcome home," she said without lifting her eyes. "Leave the boots by the door. Supper is in an hour. We eat in the kitchen now." Edmund set his boots on the stone floor and felt entirely like a trespasser. A ghost who had returned to discover the living had moved on without waiting for him. But as he breathed in the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke, one undeniable thought cut clean through the shame. He was finally home, and now he would have to earn the right to stay there. Porcelain scraped across the scarred pine of the kitchen table. Edmund sat perfectly still, listening to the loud, embarrassing sound of his own breathing. The kitchen was a cavernous room of stone and iron, nothing like the delicate plastered ceilings of the formal dining rooms he remembered. It smelled fiercely of rendered fat, sharp onions, and the harsh soap used to scrub the flagstones clean. Heat radiated from the open hearth, pressing against his face and making the old scars along his neck itch. He stared down at his bowl, thick clay filled with a dense root vegetable stew. Coarse bread sat on a wooden board at the center of the table. Elira sat across from him, still in her heavy grey wool, sleeves rolled, forearms lean and corded with real, functional muscle. She was cutting a piece of roasted carrot into tiny pieces for the toddler perched on a raised stool beside her. Wren. Edmund could not pull his eyes away from the girl. She had his own dark, curling hair, but her eyes belonged entirely to Elira, wide and calculating, and the color of a stormy winter sky. Wren stared back at him around a mouthful of mashed carrot. She did not smile. She watched him with the weary curiosity of a barn cat sizing up an injured stray dog. He reached for his spoon. His right hand gripped the handle easily, but as he reached across the table for a piece of bread with his left hand, the movement snagged. The empty space where two fingers used to be felt suddenly, humiliatingly obvious. The scarred flesh, thick and shining, caught the yellow light of the candles. Elira's eyes flicked toward his hand. Edmund froze, bracing himself for the gasp, the pitying look, the frantic questions about the war and the blast that had taken his fingers. Instead, she paused, her paring knife over a parsnip, her gaze resting on the ruined skin for exactly 2 seconds. A muscle moved once in her jaw. Then, smoothly, deliberately, she looked back down at her daughter plate and resumed cutting. "Pass the salt, Holt," she said. Holt, seated at the far end of the table, slid a small wooden bowl across the boards without a word, and without looking at Edmund either. The hierarchy of the table was glaringly clear. The Duke of Hallamere sat in the middle of it, completely ignored, while the steward and the Duchess functioned as one efficient unit around him. Edmund pulled his ruined hand back into his lap, hiding it beneath a linen napkin. Shame burned hot and acidic at the back of his throat. "She has grown," he said, his voice cracked and dry as old leather. "Children tend to do that when they are fed," Lyra said, not looking up. The words carried no venom, they were simply flat, carrying the full weight of an obvious fact. Edmund flinched. "Elira, he started, then stopped. What could he possibly say? "I bled for the crown. I lay in a ditch for 3 weeks with fever, praying for death. None of it mattered here." The war was nothing but an abstract idea in this kitchen. The draft rattling the windows was the only enemy that mattered now. "Who man?" Wren suddenly chirped, pointing a small sticky finger directly at his face. Edmund's heart hammered against his ribs. He leaned forward slightly, a desperate hollow ache opening inside his chest. "I am your father," he wanted to say. "I am the Duke." Instead, Elira scooped another spoonful of stew into the child mouth, catching a drip neatly with the edge of her thumb. "Eat your supper, Wren," she said. "Who man?" the toddler insisted again, kicking her small boots against the legs of her stool. "He is a guest," Elira said softly. The word hit Edmund harder than the grape shot ever had. A guest. He looked around the walls of his own ancestral home. He looked at the wife he had married in front of 300 guests in a grand cathedral. He looked at the daughter he had never once held. A guest. He looked down at his stew. It tasted like sawdust and salt, but he forced himself to swallow it anyway, because he needed the strength. If this kind of slow-burning, hard-won story is the kind you keep coming back for, this is a good moment to drop a comment telling us what you think Elira should demand from him next. It genuinely helps us know what stories to bring you, and there is more of their story waiting just ahead. "I intend to review the estate ledgers in the morning," Edmund said, trying to push some authority back into his voice, pulling his spine straight despite the screaming protest of his injured leg. "I need to understand the current state of this house." Holt paused his spoon halfway to his mouth, glancing toward Elira as though waiting for permission before acknowledging the request of his own lord. Elira finally met Edmund's gaze across the table. The candlelight caught the exhaustion in her eyes, the bruised circles beneath them, the fine lines pulling at the corners of her mouth. She did not look like a woman of 22. She looked like a veteran of a much longer, quieter war than the one he had just returned from. "The ledgers are in the office," she said quietly, "though I doubt you will find the numbers familiar. We do not deal in thousands of pounds anymore, Edmund. We deal in bushels of rye and cords of firewood. You may read them if you wish, but do not interrupt the morning tally that Holt keeps. He has real work to do." She wiped Ren Chin with a cloth, lifted the child off the stool and stood, her heavy wool skirt brushing the table leg. "Leave your dishes by the basin," she said to him, her tone exactly the one she had used to dismiss the stable boy earlier. "Your old chambers in the west wing are sealed shut. The roof leaked through 2 winters ago, and the floor rotted beneath it. Holt prepared the small guest room off the side landing for you. Good night." She walked out of the kitchen with Ren resting comfortably on her hip, and Edmund sat alone in the massive room while the fire popped softly in the hearth. He looked down at his ruined left hand resting on his thigh. He had survived French cavalry charges. He was not entirely certain he was going to survive his own wife. Frost clung to the narrow window panes the next morning like ground glass. Edmund woke with a gasp, his shattered leg cramping violently in the damp cold. Refusing to call for help, he spent 20 agonizing minutes wrestling the small horn buttons of his trousers with numb, clumsy fingers. He would not be a burden inside a house that had already learned to survive perfectly well without him. Leaning heavily on an ash walking stick, he dragged his bad leg down the corridor, boots clacking unevenly on the bare floorboards. Step drag. He found Holt in the cramped, windowless office, the air thick with ink and old paper and beeswax. "The Duchess mentioned the ledgers," Edmund said, sinking heavily into the chair opposite the desk, leaning his cane against the wall. "Show them to me." Holt hesitated before pulling 3 rough, stained books from a drawer. They were nothing like the elegant gold-leafed volumes his father had once kept. The covers were water-stained and smeared, with something that looked very much like dried blood from sheep shearing. Edmund opened the first book, bracing himself for a chaotic tally of mounting debt. Instead, he found something closer to brutal, unforgiving poetry. The handwriting was fast and aggressively precise. Page after page detailed the complete dismantling of his inherited pride. She had sold the silver, the mahogany, leased the hunting grounds for roof slates and winter grain. His eyes caught on an entry from 3 years earlier. Crystal chandeliers exchanged, debt cleared with the tailor, remainder traded for 40 yards of coarse wool. An irrational flash of anger hit him. She had sold the crystal for wool, before it crumbled almost instantly into deep, humiliating awe. He traced the harsh winters recorded in the margins. He saw months where she skipped buying coal entirely to pay a mason to reinforce the foundation, months where the household survived on salted pork and root vegetables just to afford spring seed. She had not simply survived, she had carved the rot out of his estate with her bare hands and forced it to walk again. "There are no outstanding debts, Your Grace," Holt said quietly, watching the color drain from Edmund's face. "The Duchess paid off the last of your father creditors 6 months ago. We operate on trade and cash surplus now, nothing more." Edmund closed the heavy ledger. It felt like a tombstone in his hands. "She sold everything," he said. "She saved the stone, sir," Holt corrected gently, though there was an unmistakable edge of steel beneath the politeness. "You have a home to return to because she was willing to freeze through 3 winters to make sure it stood." Edmund swallowed hard against the silence pressing on his ears. He grabbed his cane and forced himself upright, his leg screaming in protest. He asked. "In the lower courtyard," Holt answered. "The sheep shearers arrived from the village this morning." Edmund navigated the biting cold of the corridors and pushed open the heavy side door. The lower courtyard was pure chaos. Over 100 thick-coated sheep milled inside wooden pens, the air pungent with lanolin and animal waste. 4 rough men hauled protesting animals onto platforms, heavy iron shears snapping rhythmically through the freezing air. In the center of it all stood Illyra, wearing heavy leather gloves and a mud-streaked canvas coat, arguing fiercely with a massive bearded man holding a pair of shears. "I told you, Goss, I am not paying by the head if the fleeces come off in ragged pieces," she said, her voice cutting through the bleating sharp and commanding. "You ruined 3 pelts yesterday. If I see blood on another sheep, I will dock your pay by a full shilling." The shearer scowled, stepping aggressively into her space, towering over her completely. "I have been shearing since before you were born, Duchess," he said. "You do not know the blade. I know the price of ruined wool in the capital," she snapped back, refusing to step away from him at all. Edmund's military instincts flared instantly. A man was looming over his wife in a threatening posture. Cold, sharp adrenaline flooded through him, overriding the pain in his leg entirely. He tightened his grip on the ash cane and moved forward, boots crunching violently against the frosted gravel. "Back away from her," Edmund barked, his voice carrying the deep, commanding rumble of a cavalry officer giving orders under fire. He planted himself between Illyra and the shearer, raising his cane slightly, glaring at the larger man with a flat, homicidal stillness that made the shearer take an involuntary step back. A brief, fierce surge of pride moved through Edmund's chest. He was protecting her. "Edmund," Illyra's voice came from right behind him, not relieved at all, only exhausted in a way that felt bottomless. "Step aside," she said. He turned, confusion breaking his aggressive stance. "He was being disrespectful to you," he said. "I was simply—" "You are interrupting my negotiation," she interrupted, her eyes flashing with a cold, pale fire. She stepped around him entirely, dismissing the protective wall he had tried to build, and looked directly at the shearer instead. "Well, Goss, do we have an agreement? Or do I send for men from Belmore tomorrow?" she asked. The shearer grumbled, looking down at his own boots. "Clean cuts, Your Grace, no blood," he muttered. "Good, get back to work," she said, then turned toward the stables. Edmund stood frozen in the muck, sheep milling around his legs as the adrenaline drained away and left him feeling sick and foolish in its place. He hobbled after her, his bad leg dragging heavily behind him. "Illyra, wait," he called, catching her arm with his good hand near the stable doors. She stopped and stared pointedly at his hand gripping her coat. Her face was completely unreadable. Edmund let go immediately, stepping back. "I was trying to help," he said weakly. "You are the Duchess of this house. You should not have to argue with laborers in the mud." Illyra let out a harsh sound that might have been a laugh if it held any actual humor in it. She slowly pulled off one of her thick leather gloves. Her hand beneath it was red from the cold, the knuckles raw, the nails blunt and chipped down to nothing. She held the bare hand up between them. "Look at my hands, Edmund," she said, her voice dropping into something fierce and ragged. "Look at them closely. Do these look like the hands of a woman who needs a knight to rescue her from a rude conversation?" Edmund stared at the roughened skin, unable to speak. "You left me in an empty, freezing tomb. she continued, stepping closer, the smell of lanolin radiating off her coat. "I learned how to fight in the mud, because if I had not, we would have starved here. I do not need a protector. 3 years ago I needed a partner, and you were already gone." She pulled the heavy glove back on, her movements sharp and final. "Do not ever step in front of me again, Edmund," she said quietly. "In this valley my word is the only law that has kept a roof over our heads. If you undermine me in front of the tenants, you will destroy the only thing of real value left in this entire dukedom." She turned and walked into the dim warmth of the stables, leaving the Duke of Hallowmere standing completely alone in the freezing courtyard. 4 days passed after the incident with the shearer, 4 days of Edmund actively forcing himself to become invisible inside his own home. He stopped sitting at the center of the kitchen table, moving his bowl instead to the far corner near the drafty pantry door. He stopped asking Holt for the ledgers. Instead, he simply watched. He watched the relentless, exhausting machinery of the house, the hauling of water, the scrubbing of stones, the endless mending of wool, and slowly understood that every ounce of bread he ate was an ounce Illyra had fought the earth itself to provide. So he found the woodpile. He reached into the pocket of his heavy coat and pulled out a length of oiled leather strapping cut from the stables. He wrapped it tightly around the handle of an axe, then bound it across the back of his mangled left hand, strapping his remaining fingers securely to the wood. He could not grip properly, but he could anchor it well enough. He lifted the axe, forcing his weight onto his good leg, and brought it down hard. The oak split clean into 2 halves. "You are going to ruin your coat, Your Grace," Holt said from the archway, holding a basket of root vegetables, his face a careful mask of strained politeness even as his eyes tracked the leather strap binding the tool to the ruined hand. "The coat is already ruined, Holt," Edmund said, his voice raspy. He tossed another log onto the chopping block, and the kitchen burns through a full cord of wood every week in this weather. "The stable boy is too slight to swing this properly. I am not. It is not fitting work for a duke," Holt said. "I have not been a duke in 3 years," Edmund answered. "I was a captain of infantry, and before that I was simply a coward." He did not look at the older man. He swung the axe again. Crack. "If I cannot balance the ledgers," he said, "at the very least I can make certain my wife does not freeze while she does." He kept chopping until the blisters on his right hand burst and bled into his gloves. He kept chopping until his bad leg gave out entirely, dropping him to his knees in the sawdust and frost, panting, surrounded by a mountain of freshly split oak. A small sound broke the silence. Edmund looked up, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist. Wren stood 10 feet away, bundled in so much grey wool. She looked like a small walking sheep herself, clutching her battered wooden toy horse against her chest. She stared at him, her wide, storm-grey eyes fixed on the leather strap hanging from his mutilated hand. Edmund froze. He did not want to frighten her. He slowly reached down and unbuckled the strap, hiding his left hand behind his knee. Wren did not run away. She took a single step forward, tiny boots crunching against the wood chips scattered everywhere. She stopped at the edge of the freshly split pile, crouched down clumsily in her thick wool, and picked up a small, smooth wedge of pale oak that had splintered off a larger log. She walked over and held it out to him. Edmund stared at the piece of wood, then at his daughter, his throat tightening into a thick, choking knot beneath his collar. He reached out with his good hand, fingers trembling slightly, and took the wood from her small, mittened grip. "Thank you," he whispered. Wren pointed a chubby finger at his left hand, hidden behind his leg. "Hurt?" she asked, her voice tiny, a small bell ringing in the freezing air. Edmund swallowed hard. He slowly brought the hand forward, resting it on his thigh in plain view. The shiny, jagged scars stood out starkly against the dark fabric of his trousers. "Yes," he said honestly. "It hurt very badly, but it is better now. Only clumsy." Wren stared at the missing fingers for a long moment. She did not flinch. She reached out and lightly tapped the deepest scar with one small finger. A purely clinical investigation. Then, apparently satisfied that he was not going to break apart, She thrust the wooden horse directly into his face. "Leg broke," she demanded. Edmund took the toy. It was a crude little thing, and one of the back legs had clearly snapped off. He looked at the smooth wedge of oak she had just given him, then back up at her. "I can fix it," he said, "if you sit quietly." He pulled a small clasp knife from his pocket, and for the next hour he sat in the sawdust, ignoring the agonizing cramp in his thigh, and slowly whittled a new leg for the horse. It was an awkward, difficult process, pinning the horse against his chest with his left forearm while he carved with his right. The new leg came out slightly thicker than the others, and he could not smooth it perfectly, but he managed to wedge it into the joint anyway. He set the horse down on the chopping block. It stood unevenly, leaning a little to the left, but it stood. Wren grabbed it and inspected the lopsided repair closely. A massive, brilliant smile broke across her face, the first he had ever seen from her, and it hit him like a physical blow somewhere beneath his ribs. "Broken horse," she announced happily, trotting it across the frost-covered block. "Yes," Edmund murmured, watching her. "A broken horse, but it still runs." Up in the narrow window of the steward office, Elira stood in the shadows, her hand pressed against the cold glass. She had watched the entire exchange unfold below her. She watched the proud, arrogant man she had married sitting in the dirt, bleeding into his gloves, carefully carving a toy for a child he had never even held. She turned away from the window, her chest tight with a confusing, heavy ache. The ledger on her desk suddenly looked very blurry. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, refusing to let anything fall. That same evening, she found herself watching him differently across the kitchen table, not as the man who had abandoned her, but as someone awkwardly relearning a language he had once spoken fluently and forgotten entirely. He still flinched when Wren reached toward his left hand without warning. He still ate at the far edge of the table, as though waiting to be told he had no right to sit closer. But something in him had started shifting, the way a frozen stream shifts beneath its surface long before the ice on top shows any sign of breaking. The cough sounded like tearing paper. It started just after midnight, a dry, rattling hack that echoed down the dark stone corridors of the East Wing. Elira woke instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She threw off her heavy quilts, the freezing air of the bedchamber biting through her linen shift, and ran barefoot across the hall to Wren's small room. The child was thrashing violently in her narrow bed. Elira touched Wren's forehead and yanked her hand back instantly. The skin radiated heat, burning with a fierce, sudden fever. Wren's eyes were half open, glassy and unseeing, her breathing coming in shallow, rapid gasps. "No, no, no," Elira chanted, a raw, primal terror seizing her throat. This was an enemy she could not outsmart with clever arguments. She could not trade wool to cure a fever. She could not patch a lung with raw pine boards. "Halt!" she screamed, her voice cracking in the darkness. "Halt! Bring water!" She dragged every heavy quilt from the spare bed and piled them onto Wren, trying desperately to sweat the fever out, relying entirely on the panicked instincts of a mother who had never once relied on a doctor for anything. Footsteps pounded down the corridor, but it was not Holt who arrived first. Edmund appeared in the doorway, his shirt half-buttoned, his ruined leg dragging behind him as he crossed the small room in a few uneven steps. He took one look at Wren, and his face went perfectly still in a way Elira had only seen on soldiers who had stopped feeling fear because there was simply no room left for it. "Cold water, not ice," he said, his voice suddenly steady and clear. "Cloths. As many as you have. We need to bring the fever down slowly or her body will fight us instead of the sickness." Elira stared at him for half a second, too frightened to question how he knew this, and simply obeyed. Holt arrived moments later with a pail of water drawn fresh from the well, and the three of them worked through the rest of that long, terrible night, wringing out cloths and laying them across Wren's burning skin, replacing them the moment they warmed. Edmund pulled a low stool beside the narrow bed and leaned forward, his entire focus locked onto his daughter. He murmured softly, a continuous low rumble of nonsense words. a steady vibration that seemed to anchor her thrashing limbs each time they grew wild. He had learned this same low murmur once in a field hospital, holding down men who screamed through fevers brought on by infected wounds, and he hated that the only gentleness he had to offer his own daughter had been forged in a place built entirely for killing. Sometime near 4 in the morning, the terrible tension in the room finally broke. Ren took a long, deep breath. The rattling in her chest ceased. The terrifying heat radiating from her skin suddenly broke into a thick, heavy sweat. She turned her face into the damp pillow and fell into a deep, natural sleep. Edmund slumped back into his chair, his head hitting the stone wall behind him, releasing a long, shuddering breath. His shirt clung to him, soaked through with sweat, his face pale and drawn tight. Elira sat on the edge of the bed, resting her hand lightly on Ren's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat beneath her palm. She stared down at the damp cloth in her own hands, the sour smell of vinegar now permanently soaked into her skin. She looked up at Edmund. The dim light of the dying candle threw deep shadows across his face, highlighting the exhaustion and the white, puckered scars along his neck. "You saved her," Elira said. The words came out quiet, but they echoed loudly inside the small room. Edmund kept his eyes closed. He shook his head slowly. "I only cooled the water," he said. "The child fought the actual battle." "I would have smothered her under every blanket in the house," Elira said, her voice hitching on a sudden, terrifying realization about her own limits. "I thought I could manage everything, every rotten beam, every dent, but I panicked tonight." Edmund finally opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, at the dark circles beneath her own eyes, the messy braid coming undone, the crushing weight she had carried completely alone for 3 long years. "You are not a god, Elira," he said softly, his raspy voice gentle for the first time since he had returned. "You are allowed to be afraid when the dark comes for someone you love." Elira looked down at her lap. A single tear broke free and tracked a hot line down her cheek, falling onto the canvas of her apron. Then another followed it. She did not sob. She simply sat perfectly still as 3 years of held breath of relentless and terrifying independence finally cracked open. Edmund did not cross the room. He did not try to pull her into an embrace. He knew, somewhere deep down, that he had not yet earned that right. Instead, he reached out his scarred left hand and rested it on the edge of the mattress, an inch away from her knee, a silent anchor offered without demand. "I am a coward," Edmund whispered into the quiet room, his voice breaking apart. "I fled this house because I was terrified of failing you. I would rather have faced enemy cannon fire than the look of disappointment I knew I would see in your eyes once the money ran out completely." He slowly curled his hand into a loose fist, the missing fingers glaringly obvious in the candlelight. "But I am not running anymore," he continued. "I will chop the wood. I will cool the water. I will stand in the mud beside you. Whatever this house requires of me, I am staying for all of it." Elira looked at his ruined hand resting on the mattress between them. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her own rough, ink-stained fingers. She did not take his hand fully. She merely brushed her knuckles against his, a fraction of an inch of contact. But inside that freezing, drafty house, it felt like the sun finally cresting over the horizon after a long winter. Spring broke over the valley like a bruised rib, tender and aching. The frost heaves melted into treacherous bogs, and the air grew heavy with the smell of wet earth and crushed pine and turning soil. Ink stained the rough calluses on Elira's right hand as she sat at the desk in the steward office, aggressively crossing out a column of numbers in the main ledger. Her back ached. The damp cold of the stone floor seeped through the soles of her boots and into her calves. A shadow fell across the page. Edmund stood beside her. He did not hover, and he did not crowd her space. He simply set a rolled piece of heavy yellowed parchment on the edge of the desk. He smelled of rain-soaked wool and the harsh, cheap soap he now used to scrub horse sweat from his neck. "What is that?" Elira asked, not looking up from her sons. "A map of the Eastern Ridge," Edmund said, pulling out a wooden chair and sitting across from her, moving stiffly as his ruined thigh protested the damp weather. "I found it stored in the old hunting lodge." Elira finally lowered her quill, looking first at the map, then at him. The dark circles beneath his eyes had faded somewhat since the depths of February, and the hollows of his cheeks had filled in slightly thanks to months of heavy root stews, but the permanent tense line of his jaw remained exactly the same. "We do not hunt anymore, Edmund," she said flatly. "There is no profit in stag meat compared to the cost of keeping hounds fed." "I am not looking for stags," he replied, unrolling the map with his good hand, using the brass base of an inkwell to weigh down one corner, while his mangled left hand pressed flat against the other. The movement was easy, unself-conscious. "Now look at this road," he said, "the one bypassing Belmore." Elira leaned forward. The parchment smelled of mildew and old dust. "That is the logging trail," she said. "It washes out every spring without fail. It washed out because your grandfather refused to let loggers dredge the adjacent creek, fearing it would ruin his trout fishing," Edmund said, tracing the faint squiggly line with one scarred finger. "If we send Tam and 3 men from the village to trench the eastern bank for 2 weeks, the road will hold through the season." Elira frowned, her mind already calculating wages and lost time. "Why bother?" she asked. "The main turnpike gets our grain to the market town just fine as it stands." "The turnpike charges a toll of 3 shillings per wagon," Edmund pointed out quietly, "and it adds an extra full day of travel. If you trench this trail, you cut a day of transport off the spring barley shipment, you bypass the toll entirely, and you reach the market town before the farmers from Belmore do, which means you set the price instead of reacting to theirs." Elira stared at the map, tracing the line he had pointed out with her own eyes. He was right. It was nothing but a flanking maneuver, pure military thinking, applied directly to the business of surviving on a farm. She looked up at him. "It will cost 20 shillings in wages to trench it properly," she said, testing him. "You will save 40 in tolls alone by harvest." Edmund answered instantly, "And the premium on early barley will net another 50 on top of that." The silence in the small office shifted into something different than before. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of resentment anymore. It was the sharp, crackling silence of 2 gears finally catching and turning together for the first time. Elira leaned back in her chair, wiping a stray strand of hair from her forehead and leaving a faint smudge of ink near her temple. "You want to organize the trenching crew yourself?" she asked. "I can direct them," Edmund said, his voice now completely free of the old aristocratic arrogance he had once carried so easily. "I know how to dig a trench that will not collapse on the men inside it. I spent 2 years doing exactly that in the mud of foreign fields." "Fine," Elira said. She picked up her quill, dipped it into the inkwell, and wrote a neat authorization into the ledger. "Take Tam," she said. "Tell the men they get an extra ration of cider if the trench holds through the first heavy rain." It was not a romantic declaration of any kind. It was simply a delegation of authority. But as Edmund took the map and stood, his knee popping loudly in the quiet room, a faint, genuine look of relief washed across his scarred face that had nothing to do with money at all. A week later, Elira stood in the courtyard, her canvas cloak wrapped tight against the biting wind, supervising the loading of the first barley wagons of the season. The logging road had held. Edmund rode in on his horse, caked entirely in mud up to his thighs, and dismounted awkwardly, breathing heavy, handing the reins off to Tam before limping over to where Elira was arguing with a grain merchant from the city. The merchant, a man named Pruitt in a fine velvet coat, was busily pinching pennies over the weight of the sacks. "The scales are accurate, Mr. Pruitt," Elira said, her tone absolute as iron. Pruitt sneered slightly, his eyes dismissing her raw hands and rough woolen dress in a single sweep. "With respect, Duchess, moisture affects the weight," he said. "I must deduct 10% for dampness. Perhaps I should speak with the Duke instead. Matters of commerce are often taxing for a lady to manage alone." Elira's spine went rigid. Before she could unleash the blistering reprimand already building in her throat, a heavy, mud-caked boot stepped into place beside her. Edmund did not yell. He did not puff out his chest. He simply stood next to his wife, smelling of earth and honest sweat, and looked at the merchant with eyes that had watched men torn apart by artillery fire, eyes that were flat, cold, and entirely out of patience. "My wife is the sole authority on the yield of this estate, Mr. Pruitt," Edmund said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the damp air. "If she says the weight is accurate, then it is accurate. You will pay the full asking price in silver, or you will take your empty wagons back down the toll road and explain to your buyers why you have no barley to sell this month." Pruitt swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as he registered the sheer, terrifying stillness of the scarred veteran standing in front of him. "Of course, Your Grace," he said quickly. "I merely meant, pay the Duchess," Edmund interrupted gently. He did not step in front of her this time. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her, a solid, immovable wall protecting her flank rather than blocking her path. Elira felt the heat radiating off his muddy coat. She did not pull away from it. She held out her hand, and the merchant hastily counted silver coins into her palm, one by one. When the wagons finally rolled out, heading toward the newly trenched logging road, Elira looked down at the heavy pouch of coins, then up at Edmund. He was already turning away, checking his horse for stones caught in its hooves. "Edmund," she called out over the wind. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Supper is roasted chicken tonight," Elira said quietly. "Holt managed a good trade today. There will be hot water in the copper basin by the kitchen fire for your leg before we eat." Edmund stared at her, the wind whipping his dark, unkempt hair across his face. Slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a small, ragged smile. "Thank you, Elira," he said. "If you have made it this far into their story, you already know this is not a fairy tale built on luck. It is something earned. And if you want to see exactly how their partnership holds up once the house is finally whole again, stay with us for the final part. And consider subscribing so the next chapter finds you the moment it is ready." The months that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected to find. Edmund took over the trenching and the woodpile and the heavier repairs the carpenters could not manage alone, while Elira kept the ledgers and the negotiations and the slow, patient rebuilding of trust between the house and the village around it. They were rarely in the same room without something practical between them. A map, a column of figures, a child demanding attention, and somehow that practicality became its own kind of intimacy, built from small admissions neither one announced out loud. He learned which of her silences meant agreement, and which meant she was simply tired. She learned that his sudden stillness at certain sounds, a dropped pan, a slammed door, was not coldness, but the echo of something he could not yet put into words, and she stopped flinching away from it and started, instead, lowering her voice until the stillness passed. Autumn arrived with a violent display of color, turning the forest surrounding the house into a burning sea of copper and gold. The grand, formal dining room in the west wing remained sealed shut, its crystal long since traded away for winter wool, its delicate chairs burned for firewood during the darkest winter of all. But the massive stone kitchen hummed with a different kind of life entirely. The hearth fire roared, casting long, dancing shadows across the scrubbed pine floors. Strings of drying garlic and bundles of rosemary and salted hams hung from the heavy blackened beams overhead. Edmund sat in the worn wooden armchair near the fire, his bad leg stretched out straight toward the heat. The deep, aching throb in his thigh had become a permanent fixture by now, but the warmth of the fire kept the sharpest edges of the pain at bay. He held a piece of coarse sandpaper, smoothing the rough edges of a small wooden block. Wren sat on the rug between his boots, a sprawling pile of similarly carved wooden blocks scattered around her. She was 4 years old now, a loud, demanding, fiercely intelligent creature who ruled the lower half of the house with absolute authority. "Tower," Wren demanded, slapping a block onto Edmund's knee. "You must build a wide base first, little bird," Edmund murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble. If you build it too high without a foundation, the wind knocks it down, he demonstrated, using his scarred left hand to steady the blocks while his right hand placed them carefully on top. Wren watched intently, her grey eyes narrowed in concentration, then mirrored his movements with her own small, clumsy hands. Elira sat at the heavy pine table behind them. The ledgers were closed for the night. She was repairing the hem of Edmund's heavy canvas coat with a thick bone needle and waxed thread. She paused her stitching and watched them both. The man sitting by her fire was not the boy she had married years earlier. That boy had been arrogant, full of inherited pride, terrifyingly fragile beneath the weight of expectations he could not meet. That boy had run away. The man sitting there now was ruined in every visible way. He was scarred. He limped. He possessed no grand fortune anymore, and he woke up several nights a week, drenched in cold sweat, fighting ghosts in the dark that she could not see. But he was solid. When the roof of the northern barn had buckled under the September gales, he had not panicked. He had simply grabbed a heavy iron bar and stood in the freezing rain for 6 hours, leveraging the beams back into place while Elira hammered the securing spikes beside him. They had come back to the kitchen that night, covered in mud, exhausted, bleeding in places, and entirely together for the first time in their marriage. Elira bit off the end of the wax thread and set the coat aside. She stood up, smoothing the front of her woolen skirt, and walked over to the hearth, stopping behind Edmund's chair. She rested her hands lightly on his shoulders. Edmund went perfectly still beneath her touch, the sandpaper in his hand stopping mid-motion. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the crackle of the oak logs and Wren humming off key as she stacked her wooden blocks higher and higher. Slowly, carefully, Edmund reached up with his right hand and covered Elira's hand where it rested on his collarbone. Her knuckles were rough, the skin dry from soap and cold wind. It was the hand of a worker now, nothing like the soft hand he had once held briefly at their wedding. He pressed his thumb gently against the permanent ink stain etched into her index finger. "The winter wheat is in," Elira said softly, her voice barely carrying over the fire. "I know," Edmund replied, leaning his head back slightly against her arm. "I checked the silos with Tam this morning. We have enough surplus to last until April, even if it turns into a hard freeze. We will need to buy more wool for the weavers," she murmured, shifting her weight, her thumb brushing lightly against the raised scar on his neck. "And the eastern perimeter wall needs repointing before the frost sets in properly. I will handle the stonemason from the village myself," Edmund said. "You terrorized him the last time you spoke with him. He prefers dealing with my temper," Elira said. "He tried to overcharge me for mortar last spring." "I know," Edmund said. "I will make certain he does not try it again." Elira let out a short, quiet breath that sounded suspiciously close to a laugh. Edmund turned his head to look up at her, the harsh orange light of the fire catching the depths of her grey eyes. There was no fairy tale in any of this. There were no silk gowns, no grand balls, no romantic speeches whispered beneath the moonlight. Their marriage had been built instead on the smell of rendering fat, the sting of cold mud, the brutal arithmetic of survival, and the slow, agonizing process of learning how to stand shoulder to shoulder in the dark without flinching away from each other. It was not a romance born of comfort. It was a romance forged in the unforgiving heat of a world that had nearly collapsed entirely and had somehow held together anyway. "Papa, look!" Wren shouted suddenly, knocking her entire wooden tower over with a joyful shriek. The blocks clattered loudly against the stone hearth. Edmund smiled, a deep, genuine expression that reached all the way to his tired eyes. He looked back at his daughter. "A magnificent collapse," Wren, he said. "Now pick them up, and we will build it again, stronger this time." Elira squeezed his shoulder gently and stepped around the chair to grab the iron kettle, pouring hot water for their evening tea. The Duke of Hallowmere sat by the fire, listening to his daughter babble happily beside him, watching his wife move with the same precise, undeniable strength through the kitchen that had carried this entire house through 3 impossible years. He had left a frightened bride behind in an empty, decaying house, running from his own hollow reflection in the dark. He had returned broken, expecting nothing but ruins waiting for him. Instead, he had found a fortress, and slowly, painfully, one block at a time, he had finally found a home worth staying in. If a grounded story about resilience, flawed people, and love built from nothing instead of luck found its way to you tonight, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment telling us your favorite moment between Edmund and Elira. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who might need it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of the stories we are building here. There are many more journeys like theirs still waiting to be told.